So here we are with the Palestinian Center for the Study of Nonviolence, which was established in 1985 in East Jerusalem, thanks to the work, inspiration, and good offices of many, but under the influence of Mubarak Awad and Kutab. So the center really started with 11 volunteers, and its first activities was writing, publishing, and translating, and among them the works of great nonviolent leaders, among them clearly Gandhi, Martin Luther King, that, as we've seen, have been important influences on Awad himself when he was in the US, and of the works of Jean Sharp, which is a very important influence on the Palestinian nonviolent movement. Also, the biography of Abdul Ghaffar Khan was translated. The title of the book was "A Man to Match His Mountains," and he was someone that in the 1930s and later led the Pashtuns in an area which today would be Afghanistan in a non-violent struggle against the British, and so he stands as a Muslim non-violent example, which was very important to Awad and Kutab to bring forward, given that the two were Christians and the majority of Palestinians were not. Also, Kutab and Awad and the center devised a number of creative acts of resistance, if you like. Among them, the activity of so-called apology visits, and this would consist in Palestinians going back to their ancestral homes, asking politely, that would be the scheme, to visit and to pay the respects to the house which belonged to them in the past, and to plant a tree, for example, in the garden, for them to remember that was their house. Always, there would be no violence involved in these kind of activities, and it would be a symbolic and at the same time restorative practice for those who would do them, who would make them to their former homes. In 1985, the center printed 1,500 leaflets calling for the economic independence of Palestinians, which is one of the strong points, the economic boycott, if you like, one of the strong points of the First Intifada, to regain economic independence from the colonizer. So the idea was to purchase local as opposed to Israeli good from a certain moment, from December 2, 1985, in order to promote self-reliance and to show Palestinians and Palestinian families that they did not have to comply, if you like, with the occupation. They could be self-supporting, and this is something that we will find again during the First Intifada, both in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, but most notably with the rather famous episodes of the tax revolt of Bet Sahur, about which we will talk later. The center also published a newsletter which hosted articles of leading Israelis who advocated coexistence or opposed the occupation, among them Yeshayahu Leibovitz, Joseph Abilea, Amos Gwirtz. We found Joseph Abilea already, I think, in the slides on the very first conscientious objectors in Israel, those of the 1950s. We will find Yeshayahu Leibovitz in our classes for week number 4, when we will talk about religious group and religious leaders advocating coexistence. As for how the center was allowed to operate in such a situation, and with this very ambiguous stand in reference to the PLO, it's obvious that the center needed some sort of connection and protection, and that was given to Awad by Faisal Husseini in Jerusalem, one of the the best known families of the cities. There were working relations with journalists. Among them, it's worth to remember this name, Hanna Signora. We will meet this person again in week number 6, if we all manage to get there. And that's a journalist, and who later became the co-director of the Israeli-Palestinian Center for Research and Information, which is an educational and environmental institution, the other co-director being Gershon Baskin. It's important to note, first of all, that it's not only symbolic visits or calls to boycott and for economic independence, but it's also connections with the other side and within Palestinian society. Moreover, there was a program of village outreach, which was modeled along the lines of Gandhi's so-called, quoting, constructive program. And that meant advancing the situation of women in villages to promote adult education. There is a very famous example of the library on wheels, which would be circulating around the West Bank throughout this period. And this is an action that became an independent NGO, which is in fact LAMF. This is a very interesting acronym, if you like, not only because it's the acronym of Library on Wheels for Nonviolence and Peace, but because in Arabic there was, in Awad's writing, there was the search for the term nonviolence and how this could be translated. And finally, he arrived to the conclusion that la umf would be the best approximation to the concept of nonviolence as derived from the writings and works of Gene Sharp that he wanted to put forward. So it's very interesting that his initiative then turned to be an independent NGO, and you can find the website and you can browse through the website. Local production, self-reliance were also important points, and so on. Other elements, development of labor unions committed to nonviolent action. The idea was to move together towards the establishment of a new social order, creating self-reliance, but meaning also self-supporting institutions that could be beyond Israeli control. Remember that in his writings, Awad had said, we need to study the pervasive, the mechanisms of power, the intricacies of power, he had said. And so the idea was to go beyond these intricacies, to disenfranchise oneself from these intricacies. Most of all, we have here the one of the starting points of several popular committees that we will see in the next set of slides. As these, not all the popular committees for agricultural development, for medical assistance, for education, and so on. Not all of them were established in the name of nonviolence through the good offices of Awad and his center. However, the idea of their coordination, as well as the ideas of nonviolence, filter down to the committees through this association, or in part they contributed, certainly. There was clearly an aspect of nonviolent struggle, and that had to do with the recovery of land by villagers, land that had been confiscated or appropriated by settlers. And one of the successful campaigns was, in fact, the nonviolent struggle in the village of Tku. The settlement next to Tku is called Tekoa, and if you get to week number 4, you will see there that we have a very different account of the religious community of settlers living in the settlement of Tekoa. Among them, there was a very important and very famous religious leader, a rabbi, who was very much in favor of coexistence and dialogue and constructive relations with his neighbors, with their neighbors. However, in 1986, this non-violent struggle managed to get the land back to the villagers of Tku. Similar activities of non-violent activities took place in other villages, for example in Katana, where some uprooted olive trees were then replanted, or in Yatta, with a very similar situation, land and trees, and the nearby settlement there is called Susia, and the same in Bidia and in other places. In 1986, a new campaign was launched, which was called Shopping in Hebron, as Palestinian shopkeepers in Hebron claimed that their business was being hurt because IDF soldiers were harassing and questioning anyone entering the shop. So caravans of shoppers were sent to Hebron or mobilized to go and shop in Hebron in Palestinian shops. And finally, there was a committee within the center that was called Committee on Family Reunification to publicize the difficulties faced by tens of thousands Palestinians who could not live with their families because of ID problems, meaning that one of the members of the family would not have the proper the ID card as the same ID card as the others, and therefore would not be allowed to live with them, for example, in Jerusalem. And in this sense, this NGO, this center, tried to negotiate the case with the state, so civil society always negotiating the transformation of reality with the state, contacting members of the Knesset of the Israeli parliament to present and push forward this case. So the activities were numerous, and the center was very important. We are now already in 1986. In 1987, we have the first stone that flies of the First Intifada, and so we will now look at some of the elements that led to the First Intifada, and then we will discuss whether the First Intifada can or should be considered a violent or rather a non-violent exercise. So I'll see you in the next presentation. Bye-bye.